Christ and Character by James Allen. Chapter 3. The Yoke and the Burden. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus. Be therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Jesus. Humanity is essentially divine. Every precept of Jesus rests upon this truth. If man were not divine, the precepts would be both worthless and meaningless, and there would be nothing within him, no divine spirit which they could appeal. The very fact that a man is incapable of loving his enemies and of returning good for evil is a attestation of his inward and essential divinity. If a sin were man's natural and rightful condition, it would be right that he should remain in it, and there would be no necessity to extol him to virtue and holiness, for it would be impossible for him to act otherwise than in accordance with his original nature. Whenever men extol their fellows to virtue, nobility of action, purity of thought, and unselfishness, they unconsciously assert and emphasize man's original divine nature, and proclaim, though perhaps they know it not, his superiority to sin and his godlike power to overcome it. So long, however, as man dwelt in the habitations of sin, that he has at last come to regard himself as native to it, and as being cut off from the divine source which he believed to be outside and away from him. He had thereby lost consciousness and knowledge of his own divinity, of his essential oneness with God, the Spirit good. Humanity at the present is in the position of the prodigal son, wandering the far countryless sin, and attempting to live upon the swinish husks of base desires, the false beliefs, and every divine precept and command is a call to man to return to his father's house, his original innocence, and to recover and re-establish the knowledge of his substantial oneness with the divine. The whole of the teaching of Jesus is exhortation to man to do as he did, to live as he lived. He thereby recognizes the affirms the inherent equality of humanity with himself, and in declaring, I and my Father are one, he speaks not alone for himself, but for all men. The difference between the life of Jesus and that of other men is not arbitrarily imposed, nor that it exists in essentiality. It is self-imposed and exists in individual choice. Jesus fully recognizes his oneness with the Father, the divine source, and lived consciously in that oneness. Other men, speaking broadly, not only do not recognize their oneness with the divine, but do not believe it. It is therefore impossible for them, by virtue of their unbelief, to rise to the dignity and the majesty of the divine life. Whilst a man regards himself as being the creature's sin, believing himself to be originally degraded, he must necessarily remain degraded and subject to sin. But let him realize that he is originally divine, that he is not, never was, and never can be cut off from divine except in his own ignorance and the willful choice, that he will at once rise above sin and commence to manifest divine life. Man is primarily a spiritual being, yet as such is of the nature and substance of the eternal spirit, the unchangeable reality which men call God. Goodness, not sin, is his rightful condition. Perfection, not imperfection, is his heritage. And this a man must enter into and realize now, if he will grant the condition which is a denial or abandonment of self, that is, of his foolish desires, his proud will, his egotism, and self-seeking, all that which St. Paul calls the natural man. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus describes the will, action, and the thought by which the divine life is to be lived, and after having laid down the whole duty man as a spiritual being, a son of God, exhorts man to live as becomes a divine relationship. In the words, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." In sounding this high call to perfection, Jesus is far from commanding an impossibility, merely urging his man to live their true life with divine perfection and to give up the false life of the self-seeking and sin. The yoke which Jesus calls upon men to take upon themselves is the yoke of obedience to the divine nature which is in every man, no longer obeying the lower desires, impulses, and the burden is the burden of sinless life. Such a yoke is easy because it entails no suffering, and such a burden is light, for it is relieved of the weight of sorrow, anxiety, and fear. It is a life of self-seeking which is so uneasy, while as a burden sin, even of the mildest forms of sin, is heavy and wearisome. To know the truth of this, a man has only to look around upon the world, and then within his own soul, to recognize the divine in all men, even those called evil, and he dwelt upon it and reiterated the ideal man, being innately degraded, a lost creature, incapable of lifting himself to the heights of goodness and righteousness, nowhere turns to neither the words, conceptions, or teaching of Jesus. On the other hand, the whole his teaching affirms and emphasizes man's innate goodness and his unlimited capacity for practicing goodness. When he says, "Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, the running over, shall man give into your bosoms." He plainly tells us that if we will only put away all resentment and treat others with kindness, forgiveness, and gentle consideration, we shall then find that men are so intrinsically good that they will heap kindness without number upon us. He who would find how good and hard men are, let him throw away all his ideas and suspicions about the evil in others, and find and practice the good within himself. This also speaks of the righteousness, and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for the meek and the merciful, the pure in heart, and the peacemakers, and declares that all such are blessed. He draws our attention to the fact that those who regard themselves as evil are so far from being evil that they know how to give good gifts to their children, that even the publicans and sinners return love for love. His testimony to the guileless innocence of little children seems to have been much overlooked and ignored by those who call themselves his followers, and in all his references to and treatment of the fallen, he looks behind and away from the surface defilement which other men regard as real men, and dwell upon and exaggerate its enormity, and he sees it brings forth divine beauty and goodness hidden away under the accumulation of sin. He speaks of sinners as captives and blind, that it was his mission to preach deliverance and restore sight, clearly indicating that his sins are foreign to man, and that his sinlessness is his true state, and that he even declares that a man shall do great works than he did. Nowhere in the whole range of history or inspiration is there to be found such testimony to the lofty nobility and essential purity and goodness that is more or less latent of the human heart than in the words and deeds of Jesus. In his divine goodness, he knew the human heart, and he knew that it was good. Man has within him the divine power by which he can rise to the highest heights of a spiritual achievement, by which he can shake off sin and the shame and the sorrow, and do the will of the Father, the supreme good, by which he can conquer all the powers of darkness within, and stand radiant and free, by which he can subdue the world and scale the lofty pinnacle of truth. This can man by choice, by resolve, and by his divine strength accomplish. But he can only accomplish it in and by obedience. He must choose meekness and lowliness of heart. He must abandon strife for peace, passion for purity, hatred for love, self-seeking for self-sacrifice, and must overcome evil with good. For this is the holy way of truth. This is the safe and binding salvation. This is the yoke and the burden of the Christ.